Hello, and welcome to the sixth in an ongoing series of infinite inning reissues. I am Stephen Goldman, as always, your convivial host for this trip to the past on a mission to understand the present. When you hear that theme song grind to that premature halt, you know that we're in a reissue episode, as opposed to one of our standard issue weekly fresh catches of the day. That must be a contradiction in terms. Weekly fresh catch of the day. I know that I have been to seafood restaurants, they purported to be seafood restaurants, in which I'm pretty sure I was served the weekly fresh catch of the day. Be sure to try the mussels appetizer, they're great. Yeah, in 1898, when you caught them, they were great. This week, we return to another one of my favorite stories from the show, early in the run of the show, and one that seems timely. The story of the Brooklyn Dodgers just before World War II and the conflict the team had with the isolationist and anti-Semitic America First Committee. Before that, we visit a spot a little later in the 1940s when Jackie Robinson was asked to comment on one of his early teammates, a player, an unjustly forgotten Hall of Famer, who happened to hail from Arkansas. And of course, at that time, in that context, your place of origin carried certain expectations in one direction or another, but people can always surprise us. I happened to mention the incident with America First on Blue Sky this week, so it seemed appropriate to bring it out of the archives now. I provide plenty of context as to the movement which the Dodgers came into conflict with when we get into the story, so I'm not going to do it now because it would just be repetitious, but it happens that I have thought of that tale every single time that some elite law firm, university, or corporation like Disney capitulates to the current administration. It is never DEI or woke to stand up for your values. If we don't defend them, we won't have them. And I realize that there's a price to that. The problem is that encroachment is an endless battle that you have to keep fighting because each time you retreat, you give ground and you think, well, it's over now. I'm a yard back or 10 miles back or 1,000 miles back of where I started, but I'm good here because surely the dragon that chased us out of the old kingdom won't show up at the gates of the new kingdom, but the dragon inevitably does. And so you move back another 100 miles and another 100 miles, and suddenly you find yourself backed up against the ocean on the opposite coast of wherever you started. I realize that's a slippery slope argument, and such arguments are often frowned upon, but it seems to me to be very appropriate in this instance because it models the real world. And I don't know if the Dodgers had capitulated in this particular tale that you're about to hear, if they would have been implicated in America First activities from then on. Well, we held one rally, let's hold another one. Hey, how about displaying some of our banners or placards? How about getting some of your players to participate? How about purging all the immigrant children from your roster? That would include, at that time, the starting third baseman, the first baseman. They're not real Americans. Like Joe DiMaggio, they comb their hair with olive oil. I paraphrased there from a contemporary Life magazine profile of Joltin' Joe, which actually complimented him for using appropriate lacquer, appropriate pomade, instead of being as greasy as we Americans have come to expect from the immigrant community. I don't recall when I first read that. I have a guess that it was somewhere in the late 1980s, a long time ago now. And even then, it was shocking that that kind of language could appear in a national magazine publication. And for a long time, it was right to be shocked by it. Today, we wouldn't be surprised by it at all. The paradox of toleration, of course, is that if you don't kick back against bigoted language, then it becomes, well, tolerated. Even those of us who believe in the most expansive forms of free speech have to criticize speech with which we disagree, and that is annoying to people who spoke those words, who want to be free to characterize people in the grossest terms possible. And yes, it is sort of counterintuitive for a society based on free speech, but the only way to drive out bad speech is with good speech, or better yet, with persuasion. I should note that the hero of our second tale, Larry MacPhail, who ran the Dodgers for the team's creditors in those days, was far from a perfect person, and he had his own prejudices, but when you're right, you're right. Before we go on to that story, I want to just mention something in kind of an abstract or hypothetical way that's been bugging me. There are, even among Americans, whose heritage goes back to the overthrow of a king, who have openly wished or argued for the appointment or rise of some sort of dictator in this country. I could talk about that for hours because as inefficient as democracy is, it is far less inefficient than a nation which has to follow the whims of one man, like a kite being dragged across the sky with no choice of its own. If it happens to be flown by Charlie Brown, that kite is not long for this world. If it happens to be flown by Benjamin Franklin having a bad day, he's going to drag it into a thunderstorm. If Joseph Stalin thinks that the kite looked at him funny, then the kite's family, and anyone who ever knew the kite is going to be liquidated by nightfall. And of course, if the flyer of the kite has a sudden urge to roll into Poland or Ukraine, well, that kite's sons are going to the front lines. Oh, and if the guy flying the kite decides that your country needs a cultural revolution and everybody currently programming computers should actually be on a farm hoeing cantaloupes. Does one hoe cantaloupes? I don't even know. And everyone hoeing cantaloupes should now be programming computers, then you're going to do that for a while. And out of that will come mass starvation. Not to mention a whole lot of what I will describe in a very minimal sense as inconvenience. So why would anyone wish for that? Well, let's pretend to have an argument about baseball. Maybe this one will seem obvious to you, given that the sacrifice bunt has fallen into disrepute as an offensive weapon, but let's pick a fight about that. The simple reason that it has fallen into disrepute, and you can prove this just by looking at run expectancy tables, is that a team with a runner on first and no outs will score more runs in an inning, on average, than a team with a runner on second and one out. Now, if it's the bottom of the ninth, and getting a runner from second to third with a bunt means that you can win the game with a walk-off sacrifice fly, then perhaps trading an out for a run is worth it, because that second run has no value to you. It won't ever cross the plate. The rest of the time, you're just giving away one of your precious 27 outs. Remember, baseball is famously the game without a clock, except it really does have one. The outs are the clock. When the clock strikes 27, you go home. In the dead ball era, the incentives were perhaps a little different. It was harder to advance runners, so there was far more sacrificing, and perhaps it was marginally more justified. Still, it seems odd, at least to me, that Ty Cobb was sacrificing 15 to 25 times a season. Perhaps on some of those occasions, he was actually trying for a hit, made an out. I don't know how the official scorers looked at those things back then. But to me, if you have a fella who's really fast, as Cobb was, so the double play possibilities are limited, gets on base about 45% of the time, and pounds, doubles, and triples all over the park, I'd let him swing away with a man on. Would you believe the record holder for most sacrifice bunts in a season is actually Ray Chapman, the Cleveland shortstop? Modern era, I mean. He had 67 sacrifices in 1917. I feel obligated to note he had 3 years to go before his fatal confrontation with Carl Mays. Chapman hit .302 with a .370 on base percentage and a .409 slugging percentage, which was pretty good for a dead ball era season and fantastic by the standards of a dead ball era shortstop. He had 28 doubles, 13 triples, 2 home runs. What would he have done with 67 more plate appearances in which he might have swung away? All things being equal, he would have reached base another 25 times. I'd take that. Now, no player has sacrificed over 48 times since the lively ball came in 1920, and only one player has reached 40 since the 1920s. That was Bert Campy Campaneris with the 1977 Texas Rangers. 4 different managers ran that team in what was a very odd season. Most of the bunting was done under the last of them, Billy Hunter, who turned that team around, as Vicky Sue Robinson sort of sang right around that time. The big sack season had a brief renaissance under Jim Leyland, who had shortstop Jay Bell get into the 30s twice with the Pirates, but we will skip lightly past that to this century. 7 players have bunted 20 or more times since 2000, but no position player has done so since 2007, when Juan Pierre dropped and gave the Dodgers 20. That was under the immortal Grady Little. How about this decade? Geraldo Perdomo sacrificed 14 times for the Diamondbacks in 2023 when he was still figuring out how to hit at the major league level. This year, the major league leader currently speaking is Kyle Isbell of the Royals with 7. Last year, he led the American League with 8. He's an outfield glove man who has yet to reach a 300 on-base percentage in any significant sample of playing time. So you can see what Matt Quatraro, the Royals manager, is thinking, and yet he's still thinking 8 times, not 40 or 67. To be fair, if you prorated Isbell's playing time to something more like a full season, because he hit so poorly he hasn't gotten that, you might say that Quatraro is thinking 15, but 15 is still not 40. Now, let's say you and your friend, can you hear the scare quotes, Gunter Marquez, get into an argument about that. Gunter, in this hypothetical, longs for the olden days of one-run baseball, of bunting and running, of the Minnesota Twins teams that Gene Mauch had bunting 80 to 140 times a year. They don't give you a ring for making the most bunts in a season, but Mauch was after it nonetheless. You, being the wise feller that you are, push back gently, starting with the old basic argument, play for 1 run, get 1 run. Gunter folds his arms and refuses to hear you. You, because objectively you're right, you can refer to facts like the run expectancy tables, and so you also refuse to give ground. Now, Gunter concedes the deleterious nature of giving up an out for a single base, but insists, bunty baseball is just better baseball. You reply, quite reasonably, that's just what you like, Gunter. You can't expect the world to be run according to what you like. It's like saying there can only be one flavor of ice cream. Sometimes people will like what you do, sometimes they won't. And in this case, what you like is objectively counterproductive. And so, finally, exasperated, Gunter says, this proves why democracy will never work. We should replace the president with a king, because every political argument is like this one. I am right and you are stupid. I am sick of trying to convince you. Fortunately, the king sees it my way. So starting now, baseball will have bunting in every inning. Aaron Judge comes up with runners on first and second and no outs. He's going to bunt, just like Cap Anson did back in 1885 when things were right and proper in the world, when it was still sane and we didn't have any of your woke anti-sacrificial nonsense. Democracy, even for people who approve of it, is inherently frustrating because you can't accomplish anything by fiat. Everything is a process. Everything requires debate and persuasion. And you may feel like you won that debate, and yet in the end, no one sees it your way. Now, what you're supposed to do in that instance is abide by the will of the majority so that society continues to function. Head back to the kitchen table, get out your crayons and paper, and draw up a better argument. Try to sway them next time. Those who fail at that and instead insist that we need some sort of despot to rule over us is someone with an infantile view of human relations. They feel thwarted, and so they want to lash out. They don't have the courage that their arguments will eventually prevail, or they lack the patience to wait or the maturity to understand or tolerate the concept of delayed gratification. And so they pout and they insist that their will be imposed at the point of a gun. Aaron Judge has never executed a sacrifice bunt in the major leagues. I'd be surprised if he ever did. The first manager who asks him will require psychological evaluation. That's all I have for this reissue episode. You'll hear from me again if I need to paper over an old break or give you some notes at the end. As always, thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the end of the week with our latest episode, number 335. So stand by for a quick break, and then on the other side, we will return to episode 64, and in fact, the decade of the 1940s. hope you will forgive me for beginning by quoting a line that has been cited so often it has perhaps become something of a cliche. In Kurt Vonnegut's novel Mother Night, which is about a William Joyce-like figure, an American who becomes a radio propagandist for the Nazis during World War II, he cites a moral: we are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. This is a powerful and true message, and unfortunately, it is most needed by those least likely to hear it, young adults. From adolescence and into our early adulthood, we try on many masks, identities. We're looking for who we're going to be when we're finally fully formed. If we're ever fully formed, not all of us get there. For reasons good and bad, some of us are forever evolving, some of us are forever immature. I make no claims on behalf of myself in either category, I leave that to you. But while trying on different identities is a natural part of growing up, and mostly benign, it is not an excuse to pull a sheet over one's head and find out what it feels like to be a bigot. If every bad act could be excused by I was just a kid still figuring myself out and didn't know any better, you'd get a couple of free murders in your life, among other things. It doesn't work that way. I was recently reading about when a child first knows right from wrong, and it was much earlier than I suspected, practically in vitro. You figure it out right fast. I wouldn't say that moralism is baked into the human animal, because God knows we can disappoint you in that way. But with the exception of any children being raised by a literal pack of hyenas, they will apparently model moral behavior very easily. They get it. Here's the reason I bring all this up. With the Manny Machado trade this week, I was going to tell you all about the time the Pirates traded shortstop Arky Vaughan to the Dodgers. Arky's in the Hall of Fame, but not terrifically well remembered. That's because his career was a long time ago, because he doesn't seem to have been particularly quotable or colorful, just steady in what he did. And he died too young to give a lot of interviews late in life to writers who, roughly 20 years after the conclusion of his career, went back and started doing oral histories and documenting the game the way historians always should have. Still, he was really good. He was Manny Machado good. You will not find many single-season performances by a shortstop better than Vaughn's peak 1935, in which he led the National League in all three triple slash categories, batting average at .385, on base percentage at a cool .491, because he also drew 97 walks, which led the National League, and he slugged .607. That goes, according to Baseball Reference, for a 190 OPS plus and 9.2 wins above replacement. He wasn't always that good, no one is, but in a fairly short career, attenuated because, as I believe we've discussed in a previous episode, he just walked the hell out on Leo DeRocher and his career for 3 years in the mid-40s. Just because he was disgusted by the guy and didn't want to play for him. He came back for 2 sort of encore seasons after DeRocher was gone. Nevertheless, he compiled a career wins above replacement of 72.9, again, Baseball Reference version. And although Baseball Reference's defensive stats for him are pretty positive, the reviews of his defense during his career were not nearly so uncritical. He was considered to be steady, not great, with an excellent arm, but he was not good at charging slow rollers. It was said that he had to kind of stop and straighten up before throwing, so he didn't nip a lot of runners on close plays like that. And when he was traded to the Dodgers, they largely moved him to third base, and the commentary was, yeah, the Pirates should have done that years ago. This is sort of the Manny Machado situation in reverse, where he's playing short now because A, he wanted to when he was with the Orioles, and B, because the Dodgers, with Corey Seager out, need him to. But whereas he scored as a terrific defender at third base, at shortstop, the metrics seem to think that he falls down on every play. I happen to believe that 9 times out of 10, when trading a superstar, you cannot get equal value back, even if you get great prospects, simply because most times, even great prospects don't evolve into MVP-level players. And so I thought of the Vaughn trade as an example of a Machado-like transaction in which that was precisely what happened. The Pirates traded a 30-year-old Vaughn and got back 4 players: Pete Koskarart, Luke Hamlin, Babe Phelps, and Jimmy Wasdell, and that take is so bad that I'm not even going to bother profiling the players for you, except to say that I am very fond of Babe Phelps, Gordon Phelps, also known as the Blimp and the Grounded Blimp. I wrote about him extensively back in the day at Baseball Prospectus. As platoon catchers go, he was a terrific hitter, had some defensive issues, had some psychological issues, probably would have been a DH today, but a very good one. So I was looking up this trade this week and trying to figure out what the Pirates' rationale was for making the move. I understood the Dodgers' rationale. They got a great player, but why did the Pirates want to give one up? The usual reason is money, but that's not what they said, and it's not what the truth was. Frankie Frisch was manager of the Pirates at the time, and he made the trade. And he said, I wish Arkie all the luck in the world, except in 22 games next season when he's playing the Pirates. It was a question of plugging some gaps on the Pirates, and in order to get what I wanted, I had to give something up. But this was cover. The truth was that the two guys didn't get along. I'm not sure why. And the Pirates made a decision that if it was either Frisch or Vaughn, it would be Vaughn. I hated to see him go, said the Pirates owner at the time, but if he couldn't get along with Frisch, it was no use keeping him here. Let us posit this as an axiom. No good team ever trades its best player to appease the manager. The manager is fungible and replaceable by almost anyone who is qualified to be a manager, but the player is not. There are managers everywhere. There are only so many stars available in the major leagues at any given time. I was going to make a meal of this trade, and then as I was researching it, the All-Star game happened, and Josh Hader's tweets came out. You know what I'm referring to. Hader is a 24-year-old left-hander with the Milwaukee Brewers. He's a reliever. He's been pretty much unhittable in his short career, which has lasted 95.2 innings. At this stage of things, he has allowed 44 hits, just 44, and struck out roughly 15 men per 9 innings. So he's extraordinary, which is why he was on the All-Star team in the first place. But then, during the game, his compiled Twitter history was highlighted, in which, going back 7 years to when he was 17, he had said many things that were racist, homophobic, sexist at best. White power, LOL, that's one of the ones I can repeat without offending myself or you. Hell, I'm still offended. Reporters were waiting for Josh after the game, and his explanation was, as a child, I was immature. I obviously said some things that were inexcusable. That doesn't reflect on who I am as a person today. That's just what it is. And if it's true, I legitimately feel bad for him, except I don't believe it's true. And for the reasons that I pointed out earlier, that at 17, you should have a healthy grasp of what it means to be a benign person in this world, which, to translate, means not to be a hateful asshole. That is not one of the masks that we legitimately get to try on as a form of identity. Arguably, as with some other things, once you put that mask on, you can never take it off, even if you want to. And to prove my point, let's come back to Arkie Vaughn. Why was he called Arkie? His real name was Joseph Floyd Vaughn. But in that simple time, he was named after his home state. He was born in Clifty, Arkansas in 1912. That is less than 50 years after the end of the Civil War. There were, I promise you, Civil War veterans around alive when he was born and in his family tree. I haven't looked that up, but it's just an inevitability. Arkansas had been a slave state, was a Confederate state, and much later, in the 1950s, dragged its heels on segregation to the point that Dwight Eisenhower, who was not a big integration fan, had to send the army into Little Rock to enforce a court-ordered desegregation of the public schools. Maybe Arkie Vaughn was raised by tremendously enlightened people, I don't know, but just as much as any Tom, Dick, or Dixie Walker who was a contemporary of his, he certainly would have had the excuse, thin as it is, that environment dictated his racial beliefs had he been a bigot. Well, as I said, Arkie Vaughn came back to play for the Dodgers in 1947, which, as you know, was the most important year and probably the most important team in baseball history, because that was when Branch Rickey brought Jackie Robinson to the major leagues. So how did Jackie Robinson feel about him? Well, someone asked. Archie died in 1952. As I said, he was only 40 years old. He had retired. He was out fishing in a caldera lake in northeastern California in the Desolation Wilderness. His boat somehow turned over in terrifically deep, very cold water. I've read that it was 65 feet deep at the spot where it inverted, and he and a friend could not quite make it back to shore before the frigid water sapped their strength and they drowned. At least that's the speculation. And when the news got out, Jackie was asked to make a comment. Jackie said of Archie, "He was one of the fellows who went out of his way to be nice to me when I came in as a rookie. Believe me, I needed it." As you know, that "I needed it" contains unspoken volumes of pure abuse. Archie Vaughn put himself on the good side of all that, even though he had all the excuses. Josh Hader has none. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is The Infinite Inning. You know how a couple episodes back I said sometimes I even mess up that "well, hello there"? Well, you physically could not have heard the previous version of that I just attempted, which went like this. Well, I haven't turned the microphone on. So that was good. That was high quality, professional recording by me, your podcast host, Steve. My lack of general coordination is so extreme that even though I record this thing sitting down, I am truly lucky not to fall in the course of making this podcast. I could seriously injure myself just sitting still. One day I may poke my remaining working eye out on the microphone as I lean in to say those words. I might, ow. I had improvised one of my little stories for this spot, but I kind of got derailed there trying to record it with the microphone off, and it feels a little weird to go back, so I will put that one in next week, assuming I don't do something equally clumsy in this spot. And even though I pride myself on the spontaneity of those stories, you will, I hope, give me credit for having improvised it a week before you've heard it. I have one more story for you, and it's a reflection on current events, but I'm not going to say which current events. I'm just going to let you make that inference from what I say. And although it does not start out as a baseball story, I promise you it finishes as a baseball story, so have patience with me. You know what? Let me ask you for patience in one other sense. We're a good distance into the show here, and this story is a bit on the lengthy side. I'm not going to make one of those promises to you that I always end up breaking when I say I'm going to tell the story as briefly as possible. I mean, I will tell it as briefly as possible, but I still think it's going to have some length to it. If you don't mind, we'll take one break right here so that I don't have to interrupt the story later. So listen to whatever comes next. It may be soothing silence. Grab yourself a tall, cool glass of whatever puts you in a receptive mood. And then, when we both come back, we'll be flying shotgun with the Lone Eagle, albeit heading in a wrong, disastrously wrong direction. Hang in there, won't you? We return again, as we so often do, to the start of World War II in September 1939. Pearl Harbor was still more than 2 years away, and the events that were taking place were all happening overseas. And so, the United States, the population thereof, could afford to dicker over what our involvement should be. And there were interventionists who were arguing that we should give aid to one side or another, and isolationists who wanted us to stay out of it altogether. The isolationists were ascendant. They were generally winning the argument, but that slowly ebbed over time, particularly as President Roosevelt tended to argue that America did have a role to play. He did this in fits and starts, and one of the things about our heroes that we have to accept is that sometimes they were not as heroic and decisive as we would have liked them to be. Winston Churchill did not unrelentingly agitate for the overthrow of Neville Chamberlain and the repudiation of the appeasement policy. In fact, Chamberlain successfully co-opted Churchill to some extent by bringing him into the government. Similarly, Roosevelt did not show decisive leadership, and I think this was obviously intentional, on America taking sides against the fascists in the war. He pretty clearly felt strongly that that was what we should do for a lot of reasons, because it was the right thing, because he had an affinity for the British and the French, because he felt that in the long term we would be threatened by them, as events eventually proved. But he was also cautious, and as a member of Woodrow Wilson's administration, he had seen isolationism literally destroy the man, with a lot of help from Wilson's own obtuseness and hardened arteries. But he didn't want to repeat that, and so he led cautiously like an iceberg, sometimes telling the public that we were in deep trouble if we didn't get involved somehow, and at other times, sometimes immediately after, repudiating what he had just said. He was just trying to kind of egg the population towards the idea, bit by bit. Well, the isolationists in Congress were having none of it, and they passed a series of neutrality acts, which were intended to prevent us from selling arms to either side. It was felt at that time that one of the reasons we had been dragged into World War I was by munitions manufacturers who were profiting from the war, and so they just wanted to keep us out of it completely. Roosevelt argued that this was helping the aggressor nations by not propping up the people who were defending themselves from said aggressor nations, i.e. Germany, i.e. Japan, that was doing obscene things in China at the time. And eventually he did get a bit of his way. There was first something called the cash and carry policy, which said that we could sell arms to other countries provided they paid up front and took it out on their own ships. And then much later, there was Lend-Lease. In the interim, a couple of advocacy groups sprung up to either counteract what was seen as the president's lack of leadership in terms of helping countries like Great Britain and France, or alternatively, to deflect what seemed like his obvious belief that we should, or eventually would, be involved. On the former side was the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. And on the other side, the opposite side, was a group called America First. And its biggest spokesman became the Lone Eagle, one of America's most famous heroes, one of the most famous men in the world, the flyer Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, who just on the eve of all this happening had gone to Germany and accepted a medal from Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, the man who would soon be tasked with bombing Great Britain and many other countries, mostly successfully, into submission. This rendered his point of view somewhat suspect for some people, and as time went by, he revealed some attitudes that would make it even more suspect. But in the short term, his argument was that were we to be involved in the war, it would be a war of choice. And that second of all, even if it were not a choice, well, the Allies had already lost, that America could not possibly defeat the fascist powers. He said, hey, we didn't have a stake in this because America is in no danger of being invaded, and it's only, quote, powerful elements in America who desire us to take part. They represent a small minority of the American people, but they control much of the machinery of influence and propaganda. Gee, I wonder who he was talking about. That was May 19, 1940. He eventually came out and said who he meant. I'll get to that in a second. Lindbergh, April 17th, 1941. Personally, I believe it will be a tragedy to the world, a tragedy even to Germany, if the British Empire collapses. But I must tell you, frankly, that I believe this war was lost by England and France even before it was declared, and that it is not within our power in America today to win the war for England, even though we throw the entire resources of our nation into the conflict. With all our organization and industry, we are not, and will not, be able to transport an army across the ocean large enough to invade the continent of Europe successfully, as long as strong European armies are there for defense. But I thank God It is not yet too late for us to save our country from the chaos and the failure of this war. About a week later, he gave a very similar speech in New York, and I just want to point out this one part, which had a thought that was not uncommon among the isolationists of the time. It wasn't just isolationism, it was defeatism. I ask you to look at the map of Europe today, Lindbergh said, and see if you can suggest any way in which we could win this war if we entered it. Suppose we had a large army in America trained and equipped. Where would we send it to fight? The campaigns of the war show only too clearly how difficult it is to force a landing or to maintain an army on a hostile coast. Suppose we took our navy from the Pacific and used it to convoy British shipping. That would not win the war for England. It would, at best, permit her to exist under the constant bombing of the German air fleet. Suppose we had an air force that we could send to Europe. Where could it operate? Some of our squadrons might be based in the British Isles, but it is physically impossible to base enough aircraft in the British Isles alone to equal in strength the aircraft that can be based on the continent of Europe. This, of course, was a mighty failure of imagination. On June 6, 1944, we showed exactly how much materiel and men and, yes, airplanes one could base in Great Britain and crush the hell out of a fascist army. And a very severe bombing campaign had begun long before that, also based out of the British Isles. One more quote for the moment from that speech. We must turn our eyes and our faith back to our own country before it is too late. And when we do this, a different vista opens before us. Practically every difficulty we would face in invading Europe becomes an asset to us in defending America. Our enemy and not we would have the problem of transporting millions of troops across the ocean and landing them on a hostile shore. We would then do the bombing from the air and the torpedoing at sea. This idea that we would be better off fighting here in the continental United States than in Europe comes up again and again in the pre-war arguments of the period, and I find it fascinating that so many so-called patriots could look at what was happening in Europe and in Russia and decide that we would be better off fighting the enemy in the streets of New York or Los Angeles or wherever and have those cities bombed to rubble than it would be to have their cities bombed to rubble. This was a very generous thought on their part. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to counteract Lindbergh. He sent some proxies out to do it, like Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, but he didn't want to risk going blow for blow with him, because again, Lindbergh, since he flew solo to Paris in May of 1927, had been accorded all the celebrity that we give an astronaut who landed on the moon, but more so. He was accorded a lot more gravitas than he actually had. So Roosevelt, who was increasingly becoming convinced that Lindbergh was not just a political opponent, but an actual literal traitor, an anti-Semite who was in sympathy with Germany's war aims, attacked him and people who shared his views obliquely. Here is an excerpt from Franklin Roosevelt, December 29, 1940, Great Arsenal of Democracy address, where he tries to convince his countrymen that we must supply the Allies. First, I want to give you a sense of what the President of the United States sounds like when he recognizes that a foreign power that is not at war with us is not necessarily just competing, but is ultimately in the course of taking actions that represent an extreme threat to our way of life. Please note there is no rationalizing Germany's actions or equivocating about them.
The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. It was only 3 weeks ago that their leader stated this: there are two worlds that stand opposed to each other. And then in defiant reply to his opponents, he said this: others are correct when they say, with this world we cannot ever reconcile ourselves. I can beat any other power in the world. So said the leader of the Nazis.
And now he addresses those like Lindbergh and the America First Committee, who said that we had already lost and we might as well get used to the fact of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan.
There are those who say that the Axis powers would never have any desire to attack the Western Hemisphere. That is the same dangerous form of wishful thinking which has destroyed the powers of resistance of so many conquered peoples. The plain facts are that the Nazis have proclaimed time and again that all other races are their inferiors and therefore subject to their orders. And most important of all, the vast resources and wealth of this American hemisphere constitute the most tempting loot in all of the round world. Let us no longer blind ourselves to the undeniable fact that the evil forces which have crushed and undermined and corrupted so many others are already within our own gates. Your government knows much about them, and every day is ferreting them out. Their secret emissaries are active in our own and in neighboring countries. They seek to stir up suspicion and dissension, to cause internal strife. They try to turn capital against labor, and vice versa. They try to reawaken long slumbering racial and religious enmities, which should have no place in this country. They are active in every group that promotes intolerance. They exploit for their own ends our own natural abhorrence of war. These trouble breeders have but one purpose. It is to divide our people, to divide them into hostile groups, and to destroy our unity and shatter our will to defend ourselves.
Sounds a lot like Facebook in 2016, doesn't it? Let FDR finish.
There are also American citizens, many of them in high places, who unwittingly, in most cases, are aiding and abetting the work of these agents. I do not charge these American citizens with being foreign agents, but I do charge them with doing exactly the kind of work that the dictators want done in the United States. These people not only believe that we can save our own skins by shutting our eyes to the fate of other nations. Some of them go much further than that. They say that we can and should become the friends and even the partners of the Axis powers. Some of them even suggest that we should imitate the methods of the dictatorships. But Americans never can and never will do that.
There's a lot more, and I encourage you to listen to the whole speech. As we have seen, despite comments like this one, Lindbergh just went right on talking. So FDR decided to take him on just slightly more directly. Lindbergh had been in the Army Air Service in the 1920s and had been commissioned a second lieutenant. As the war scare heated up, reserves were called up back into the active military. Lindbergh was not called. The answer as to why seems rather obvious now, but people wondered why. Roosevelt did not say anything about this, but prior to a press conference, his press secretary went to the reporters and said, hey, if you want to ask the chief about Lindbergh, he just might have something to say about that. So, of course, they did ask, why haven't you called up Lindbergh? Roosevelt responded by telling a story about the Civil War. He said that in the Civil War, a lot of interesting people fought on both sides, people that you wouldn't have expected, but at the same time, a lot of people that you might have expected would have been involved were not brought in by the two sides. For example, he said the Vallandighams were not brought in on the Union side. Well, the reporters didn't know what he meant by the Vallandighams. In specific, he was referring to Clement Vallandigham, who was a congressman from Ohio, and in general, he was talking about the Copperhead faction, Northerners who were in favor of ending the war and letting the South go on the basis of continuing slavery, in part because they happened to be cool with slavery, and in part because they felt that the North could not win, and did what they could to undermine the war effort to the point that Lincoln briefly had Vallandigham thrown in jail and then deported him to the Confederacy. Roosevelt then started talking about the Revolutionary War. Once upon a time there was a place called Valley Forge, he said, and there were an awful lot of appeasers that pleaded with Washington to quit because he couldn't win. Okay, so now the reporters were scratching their heads, and they said, "Are you still talking about Charles Lindbergh?" And Roosevelt said, "Yes." He also said, and I think this was a reference to Lindbergh's wife, the writer Anne Morrow Lindbergh. She had just written a little book, The Wave of the Future, that said that fascism was the new thing and we might as well get used to it. He said there were people who had adopted a curious attitude and held the idea that there was a new order and a new form of government in the world to which democracy must yield. Out of one corner of their mouths, they say they do not like dictatorships, and out of the other, they say that the dictatorships are going to defeat democracy and that they may as well be accepted. He then added he did not think that that was good Americanism, and in fact that he thought it was stupid. All this gets published, and Lindbergh resigns his commission. That was showing him, and he goes on talking. And he has some traction with his ideas. America First attracted huge crowds to their rallies, because there are always some people who will go to a rally. He was frustrated, though, because FDR had a bigger microphone, and the government was following its own policy, not his policy. In September of 1941, the government, FDR, ordered the Navy to defend our shipping, which would seem to be uncontroversial, but just as in World War I, when William Jennings Bryan resigned as Secretary of State because he thought that this was too provocative of the Germans, well, Lindbergh thought that this too was provocative and would inevitably lead to war. We were already in an undeclared war, an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic, but nevertheless, so he decides that on September 11th, 1941, in a speech at Des Moines, he's going to blow the lid off this whole thing. He's going to call out those secret, sinister forces that were pushing the country towards war. And rather than read you the whole quote, I will save some time and just tell you that they were the Roosevelt government, the British government, and, of course, the Jews. In doing so and calling out the Jews, he adopted pretty much the straight Hitler line. He said, no person with a sense of the dignity of mankind can condone the persecution of the Jewish race in Germany, but no person of honesty and vision can look on their pro-war policy here today without seeing the dangers involved in such a policy both for us and for them. Instead of agitating for war, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it in every possible way, for they will be among the first to feel its consequences. Tolerance is a virtue that depends upon peace and strength. History shows that it cannot survive war and devastation. In the long term, Lindbergh damaged his reputation for the rest of his life because, although a lot of people who knew him insisted he was not an anti-Semite, if it walks like an anti-Semite and quacks like an anti-Semite, well, what you got there is a warmonger and hateful duck with a toothbrush mustache. In the short term, it changed the perception of America First from a pro-American defense organization or an anti-war organization to a pro-anti-Semitism organization. And so they gained one kind of support, but fortunately, most Americans had broader minds than that, and they lost a lot more. And they lost the Brooklyn Dodgers.
And as we pivot between those two monolithic entities, the Dodgers and the Jews, I think it's time to take a break. As soon as you say the anyone, I start to wonder about you. I mean, where does the group meet? And why have I never gotten my check? Now, to be fair, maybe they never had the Brooklyn Dodgers in the first place. The Dodgers at that time were run by one Leland S. MacPhail, Larry MacPhail. MacPhail goes to show how complicated people can be and why it's so hard to have heroes, because there are very few of us who are unalloyed good. MacPhail was discovered by Branch Rickey, brought into baseball at his recommendation, but later broke with Rickey, and they became bitter enemies. He was an innovator who brought in radio broadcasts of games when most of the other owners believed that radio would destroy attendance. He began night baseball. He inaugurated air travel for his team, and he revived a Dodgers franchise that, as I seem to find myself saying fairly often, had been bankrupt and dead for a generation. He was also a severe alcoholic, erratic, sometimes prone to violence, and later, as owner of the Yankees, was one of the people that baseball appointed to try to shoot down Rickey's plan to break the color line. He was also a patriot who had enlisted the day that the U.S. declared war in 1917, and later staged his own personal, and I suspect highly inebriated, mission to kidnap Kaiser Wilhelm for America. He only got the Kaiser's ashtray, but he gets an A for effort. Anyway, people contain a lot of contradictions, and you can be someone who is for the United States of America on one hand and be bigoted against a good percentage of its population on the other, and don't ask me to explain it, I can't. In the summer of 1941, one William T. Leonard, executive chairman of the Brooklyn chapter of the America First Committee, called up MacPhail. He wanted to stage an America First rally at Ebbets Field. I don't know if Lindbergh would have spoken there or not, but nevertheless, the general sentiment would have been the same as those that Lindbergh expressed. What Mr. Leonard did not realize was that Larry MacPhail himself was a chairman too. He was chairman of the Bronx chapter of the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. That is to say, the group that was diametrically opposed to the Lindbergh gang. Mr. Leonard called me and asked me for the field, MacPhail said, and I told him he couldn't have it, whereupon he began to tell me who he was and who I was and what they were going to do to me. Then I told him what I thought of the America First Committee. They are not going to get Ebbets Field for any America First rally. Now, you have to read between the lines a bit, but I hope you'll understand when I say that, befitting a man with a temper, Larry had a way with words. Here's how one columnist put it. Larry the Red, he was a redhead, is an educated man, a graduate in law, all in all, an exceedingly literate chap. But if you want to talk in the argot of Pier 6 with him, he is adequately equipped to reply in kind. We will bet he sizzled, singed, scorched, and shriveled the ears of William T. Leonard, executive chairman of the Brooklyn chapter of the America First, Nazis Next Committee. All in all, having spent some time researching this incident, what I believe that columnist was trying to convey to you was that Larry MacPhail told William T. Leonard, executive chairman of the American First Committee, to go fuck himself. Leonard seems to have literally said, well, I never, and made the whole thing public, insisted on a public apology from MacPhail. From no person affiliated with this committee or outside of it have I heard any of the unseemly terms applied to the opposition that you applied to such outstanding Americans as Colonel Lindbergh, Senator Wheeler, Senator Nye, and to the entire membership of the committee. And an attorney connected with the America First Committee, one George Reissue, was quoted as saying that if some Flatbush residents sought to restrain the nuisances of night baseball, their action would indicate a far less spirit of intolerance than Dodger President MacPhail exhibited. MacPhail said he'd apologize, and he specified a time and a place. On the steps of Borough Hall, on February 1st, 1999, if, he said, the committee is still in the league. As for the letter from the lawyer, he was trying to gin up some kind of protest that would disrupt Dodgers games. That wasn't going to happen. Even if the America First Committee couldn't recognize the threat that the fascists posed, they could recognize that they were not as popular as baseball. And John T. Flynn, who was chairman of the New York chapter and I guess outranked Mr. Leonard, chairman of the Brooklyn chapter, as did Leonard himself. "It is an outright falsehood," Leonard said, "that our committee has made threats to injure or stop night baseball." Flynn said, "We are not against baseball. We are against war. We want more baseball and less war." MacPhail is just trying to confuse the issue of freedom of discussion with baseball, a sport noted for its freedom of discussion. As someone who once saw a kid wearing a Yankees cap beat up on the streets of Boston, I can tell you that freedom of discussion and baseball do not always go hand in hand. But in any case, Flynn was also missing one essential point about the freedom of discussion, which is that the Dodgers owned Ebbets Field, and that Larry MacPhail, if he didn't own the Dodgers, he did have a chunk of them, but nevertheless, he was acting for the ownership, and as such, had decision-making power over Ebbets Field. It was his house. And freedom of speech means that you are not obligated to host a discussion that you do not want to host in your house. They never did get that discussion, the America's First Committee. They were badly damaged that fall by the Lindbergh remarks I already described to you, and in December, Pearl Harbor came and they voted to disband. Charles Lindbergh was ready to serve at that point, at least against the Japanese, but he was never called because the Roosevelt administration did not feel real comfortable with that, and it's hard to blame them. You know who did join up? Larry MacPhail. We're over 75 years away from those events now. Larry MacPhail's plaque hangs in the Hall of Fame, despite his opposition to Branch Rickey and integration later on, and Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis hangs in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, right near the entrance. Everybody who walks into that building sees the Spirit of St. Louis. As I said, heroes are imperfect. Nobody is in the right all the time for all of their lives, so we have to take people kind of on balance. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to praise Larry MacPhail for facing down the America First Committee, and it's easy to criticize Charles Lindbergh, but I'm sure that there were members of that committee who were not animated by anti-Semitism and believed that what they were doing was right for the country, especially when the First World War, which disappointed so many Americans in so many ways in terms of the results they got for so much sacrifice, was still easily in living memory. That said, the fascist menace was not a subtle one. By the time these debates were happening, a whole lot of countries had been crushed under their heels, and accommodation were, at best, whistling their way through the graveyard in utter ignorance of what was so obvious, in defiance of what men like President Roosevelt or Prime Minister Churchill were saying over and over and over again, and not them alone. And at worst, they were insincere. Regardless, when someone says, "We are not against baseball, we are against war, we want more baseball and less war," but they advocate a policy that would lead to a whole lot less baseball and a whole lot more war, you have to look inside what they're saying and try to figure out what their motives are. You can't just assume they have good intentions, because if you do, you're a sucker. Sometimes someone makes an argument that asks you to subscribe to a point of view that's contrary to your own interests, and there's no deeper explanation than this. They're working against your own interests. And motives, at that point, motives don't even matter. By Alexander Hamilton's Golden-Laid Snuffbox, we have reached the end of another episode.
This part of the ending is where I used to give the Twitter handles for both the guests and myself, but for our purposes today, there is no guest, and for my purposes all the time, Twitter no longer exists. However, you can find me on social media at stephengoldman.bsky.social.
You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Go to Facebook, search Infinite Inning, knock, I will let you in. Pie and coffee will eventually be served. And finally, inevitably, if you find yourself with a spare moment, please go to Apple iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show, and more importantly, it helps my fragile self-esteem. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by the number 21. Our producer is Blinders Johansson. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have in fact been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. Did you know you can sing
Dr. Rick Mooring to the tune of the Beatles' Lady Madonna? Try it. It works. Well, speaking of the Beatles for the third time this episode, if what they say is true, and the guacamole you make is equal to the guacamole you take, then I won't starve.
But to finish my thought from about 7 years ago, I'll be back with a new episode in just a few days. Until then, stay safe, though you find yourself lost in the infinite inning.